wonderful person, this is Anton, and today I wanted to discuss a somewhat intriguing topic in regards to, well, this. Something that often shows up as sensationalist headlines involving some kind of an alien, or specifically an alien skull, discovered in some cave from some ancient civilization, that very often ends in the conclusion that aliens used to exist on the planet and then they basically left. But the thing is, the actual scientific reality in this case is somewhat intriguing and technically way more fascinating than any of these alien stories. Because in many ways this tells us a lot more about what it is to be a human and what a lot of human cultures on the planet seem to actually share without even realizing. And so in this video, we're going to be discussing the idea behind body modifications and specifically focusing on these cranial modifications, whose initial discovery by the Western civilization at first actually shocked a lot of people. Here we're talking about the practice of intentionally deforming the shape of the human skull. And when archaeologists find these elongated conical skulls, in many cases it basically results in these hyped up sensationalist headlines. Look everyone, it must be extraterrestrials. But in this video we're going to be discussing some of the modern evidence we have for all of this, because as we actually examine the evidence, it'll become pretty clear that this is not just some kind of an ancient outlier, but seems to be an incredibly widespread activity present on almost every continent on the planet, with Antarctica being the obvious exception. In other words, this apparently happened in many different cultures out there, and for reasons that seem to be entirely different and sometimes not entirely understood. But here I guess let's start with the most famous example, and the one that usually creates the most sensationalist headlines. Let's start with the Paracas culture that used to exist in Peru approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And here this is an example of a very fascinating culture that flourished on the southern coast of Peru on the Paracas Peninsula, and it's widely regarded as one of the earliest complex societies in South America that's actually very famous today for its very sophisticated textile arts and its somewhat unique burial practices. And well, this is one example of their textile industry. Once again, this is from 3,000 years ago. And so Paracas people produced what are considered to be some of the finest textiles in the pre-Columbian Americas. This involved intricate, brightly colored cloaks and various garments, such as this wonderful hat right here. Some of them were made from cotton, some of them were made from llama or alpaca wool, and many of them involved a lot of different figures and supernatural beings representing their religious beliefs. And while their exceptional textiles were also kind of connected with their burial rituals, or technically their mummies, because it turns out that part of the culture also involved placing deceased individuals in a kind of a seated position and wrapping them in many layers of these textiles to basically create a kind of a mummy. Obviously today we have no idea why exactly this was done, but the point is that this was a really complex culture. And in their culture, they also practiced what's known as the cranial deformation, with the examples of the skulls from this culture visible right here. And well, here this was done in childhood, when the child's head was bound in order to elongate it, and in order to produce various shapes. And well, today for this particular culture, it's actually believed to be possibly some kind of a status symbol, or maybe done for somewhat aesthetic reasons to make the skull appear more beautiful. And well, out of all cultures we're going to be discussing, this one produced some of the most complex cranial modification. Which is why researchers do believe that this was probably a status symbol, essentially representing different levels in a society by basically modifying the skull and changing the shape of the head. And well, back in 2014, naturally, this produced a lot of hype once again, mostly because some of the preliminary DNA tests suggested some kind of an unknown mutation. But a much more recent study clarified all of this, with the results eventually showing us some very interesting genetic markers, including connections to Europe and even the Middle East, and basically not a purely Native American DNA, implying some kind of an additional migration that must have happened around this time. Although a much more likely explanation suggests that there must have been some kind of a DNA degradation or even contamination, which is obviously quite common for skulls that are 2,000 years old. But, as I mentioned, what's actually remarkable is that, first of all, this is obviously not the only culture to practice this. As a matter of fact, these skulls, or similar skulls, have been discovered pretty much everywhere. And one of the oldest collections is approximately 13,000 years old. and surprisingly from Australia. You can learn more about this in the link from the Smithsonian Institution in the description, but in essence back in 1967, a bunch of these skulls were discovered in Australia, all of them possessing a relatively unusual long shape. These are now referred to as the cow swamp skulls. And though at first this was hypothesized to be our ancestor, Homo erectus, eventually it was confirmed that this seemed to have an artificial deformation involving a cultural skull modification similar to the Paracas. But in this case, we know even less about this culture, so nobody has any idea why this culture practiced cranial modification as well. But around the same time, in Neolithic China, people were actually doing something extremely similar. Here in the province of Jilin, near the Hutamuga site, researchers once again found extremely similar skulls, specifically 11 of them, that most likely represented the early practice linked to some kind of a social status once again. But what might come as a surprise to all of us is of course the fact that this was also practiced in Europe and even in somewhat recent times. And in this case, a lot of evidence comes from things like, for example, coins, ancient coins. Here's, for example, one of the kings of a culture referred to as the Alcons. In this case, his elongated head was extremely likely produced using a very similar modification technique. It would resemble something like this. This is a description from the 1921 German book on anatomy. And so a lot of different depictions of different kings and different royalties from Europe and Asia, including this Iranian king Rostam, seem to all depict an extremely similar feature that could have only been produced as a result of cranial modification. And we also obviously have actual skulls. Here's one from 5th century Hungary. Here's one a little bit to the north in Germany. And here's a bunch from Samarkand in Central Asia. All of these were actually around the same time. As a matter of fact, even Vikings, especially the ones on the island of Gotland, seem to practice this as part of the rites of passage. In fact, a much more recent version of this, from less than 200 years ago, was even practiced in certain regions of France near Toulouse. This was referred to as le bandeau. And surprisingly, this was even going on in the 20th century. And at least in this case, we know exactly why this was done. And it's nothing to do with the status symbol or with being a royalty. Instead, this was actually almost the opposite. It was because in the 19th century France, people thought that they could protect the baby's head by tying it in a certain way in order to avoid injury. And though at first it was meant just for the protection, eventually it became part of the local culture and was widely practiced among French peasants. And the only reason it suddenly stopped was actually because of one thing: World War I and major advances in medicine, and specifically medical pressure, that essentially prevented anyone else from ever doing this in France. And so a lot of different cultures practice this, and for what seems to be somewhat different reasons. And intriguingly, the last culture to finally stop doing this is in Central Africa. Here this is the Mangbetu culture. The culture known for a very distinct look and distinctive historical customs. Today, most of their descendants live in the central Congo region, but essentially here they were known for this practice of lipombo, the head elongation. This involved wrapping the baby's head in an extremely tight manner that would produce this extremely elongated head that was often considered to be a sign of high status, beauty, and intelligence. And so at least in this case, we know exactly why this was done. But this practice began to decline in the 1950s, mostly as a result of the Western influence in this region. And so today, only some of the oldest people in this region still have these types of heads. And that actually brings us, I guess, to the next part of this video. So we know why this culture did it, but what about everyone else? Well, interestingly, as you can imagine, when some of the first Spanish explorers met people with these head shapes from the Andes, they were actually horrified. They even made up stories about brains bleeding out of ears, believing that this practice was evil and resulted in deformed humans. But today, based on a lot of different studies, we know that generally this doesn't actually seem to change anything inside the brain and does not affect the development of the brain or the intelligence. Instead, it does seem to possess a variety of cultural purposes. And the assumption today is that in most cases, this is a marker of status. Basically, different shapes belong to different elite groups. But we also know that for some cultures, especially at least one culture in Peru, the Calagua culture, they seem to change the shape of their heads only to resemble the mountains they came from. So it was a kind of an identity thing, with basically the heads assuming mountain shapes. And honestly, that's actually pretty cool. But in some cases, the actual reason might not really matter as much, and it was really the act of binding that seemed to be very important. In some cultures, this was seen as a kind of a protection or a rites of passage for the newly born child. But we also know that in most cultures, this was only practiced by some people. In other words, even in the same family, only some individuals seem to have these cranial deformations, whereas other ones did not. And so this implies that this was never really some kind of a rigid rule, and perhaps more of a personal or even family-based choice for one reason or another. But overall, we know that in terms of social status, this seemed to be the case for a lot of South American cultures, including the Mayans, and even the nobility in the Philippines. And here, by having different head shapes, it presented to others some kind of a high social rank or noble birth. In other cases, this was an indication of being from a certain group, basically to distinguish members from a specific tribe or from a specific ethnic group. Other cultures, like the Mangbetu, mostly practiced this as part of the aesthetics or beauty. And lastly, the French, in the 19th century, mostly practiced this as a kind of a pseudo-medical solution. Or basically they believed that this protected infants from accidental impact or accidental damage. But importantly, every single region on the planet contains at least one example where this was practiced by someone for one reason or another. And so none of this is bizarre, unusual, or alien. As a matter of fact, these modifications are extremely universal and in some sense unite us as humans. And all of this obviously goes way beyond cranial modification, because humans have always used their bodies as a kind of a canvas, and some practices were quite extreme. For example, the now infamous case of foot binding practiced in China. This practice lasted for over 1,000 years and involved breaking and binding the feet of young girls to create what's known as the lotus feet, an unusual standard of beauty in ancient China that deformed feet to look something like this. And this practice only disappeared completely in the mid-1950s. But when it comes to some of the oldest and more unusual practices, it actually usually involves teeth, something that existed as far back as 13,000 years ago. And this usually involved drilling holes in the teeth and then filling them with a lot of different stuff. For example, in Italy, they used a tar-like substance that eventually made their teeth somewhat black, whereas in South America, the Mayans, instead of using tar, used jade, basically making their teeth appear green. And the ancient people living in Vietnam seem to use an unusual iron-based paste to permanently blacken their teeth completely. And so just like the cranial modification, dental modification was also used for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different cultures. And here, since usually you expose your teeth when you smile or when you talk, this was also probably used for some kind of a status symbol. But some of the strangest practice that actually happen in many different cultures, once again, is the practice of castration. And so here the idea of eunuchs, or basically men who were castrated very young, seems to be present everywhere from Rome to Egypt to China and in a lot of other places. And because castration was done when the boys were still very young, it also surprisingly modified the rest of the body, because as these boys grew up, due to the lack of certain hormones, they would actually grow to be very different from other men. For example, in many cases they would appear much more slender and have much longer limbs, and would also be slightly taller. And once again here this was done for so many different reasons. As a matter of fact, one of the more unusual examples here are actually the castrati from the 18th century Italy. Here this involved male singers who possessed a very beautiful voice when they were young, and so by castrating them before puberty, they would actually retain this high vocal range in order to become permanent soprano or contralto performers. And so this unusual practice was really all the result of performance in the opera. Something that I think we would probably find kind of barbaric today, but something that was widely accepted in the 18th century Italy. But obviously, if I were to go through every single example of different body modification out there, this video would be like 3 hours long. Because here we have everything from 5,000-year-old tattoos to various types of piercings, which once again suggests that body modification is a universal human phenomenon. And there is absolutely nothing alien about this, as this is as human as it gets. In some sense, some scientists even describe this as basically parents investing in their kids' future, at least in the only cultural way they knew back then. And this of course reminds us that our ancestors and all of the other cultures around the planet are not that different from us after all. They just have a very different way of showing who they are, and it's that part that I think usually produces a lot of xenophobia and a lot of cultural clashes. But the point is that we are all still kind of basically the same. And based on a lot of this archaeological evidence, we've basically been doing the same thing, but just in different ways for at least 13,000 years. But we'll definitely come back and discuss some of these additional topics in some of the future videos, because this is a pretty cool phenomenon. And so on that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support the channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.